Hello and welcome to episode number 30 of the VCD Roundtable. Today, Sasha and I are still in the US. We run the Architecture Think Tank on Monday and Tuesday. You will see a few more videos coming out from that one in the next few days. If you're interested, follow us on the LinkedIn channel for that. We are also participating in the Cloud Fest, so that is why we are not at home like the other ones. But before we go into today's topic, which is going to be user management and multi-factor integration, let's do a quick round of hellos. Handing over to Toby.
Hello from my side. Welcome to episode 30. Matthias.
Yeah, hello. I think users are still overrated. Sasha.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sasha. Welcome.
So, yeah, to kick everything off, as Matthias said, user management is completely overrated. We should actually put everybody in as an admin and give everybody the password VMware 123 bang. That makes it easiest.
At least you chose one with like a special character.
It has all the criteria. It has 8 characters. It has uppercase, lowercase. It has numbers in it and a special character. Yeah, so it would be perfect. No, but I think speaking of user management, before we dig into SAML and SSO, I mean, we had the topic of multi-tenancy last time, and one of the important parts of multi-tenancy is always that you are able to also hand over user management to the tenant. So it's actually quite a good follow-up to the previous session. And in the past, the usual approach with VMware vCloud Director has always been we are going to make primarily, or at least in the starting point, local users. That motion has changed a bit since VMware announced at least that they are not actively supporting local users in depth anymore. And that service providers should either provide a central user database by themselves, or actually do this on a per tenant basis. So before we get into that, the easiest approach to do that is to attach either an LDAP or Active Directory. However, you need Active Directory, you connect via LDAP in that case, so it's all of them more or less the same. And then you can actually link groups and users into it. As always, as with most solutions, child-parent relationships inside of groups are always something to test very carefully if that works. Best approach for nearly every solution and everything out there on the market, what we all, those who have worked in user management for a while have learned is don't build hierarchical groups because that usually works within the Microsoft products, maybe, but third-party products, it gets a bit more difficult. So you can import these groups, you can import the users, and then you assign the specific roles to that. There is also a way to derive roles from the LDAP properties if you want to do that, or from the identification source. So that is basically what we are at with. Typically, when we do service provider projects from a design perspective, we also review with the service providers if the default roles are good enough or if they need dedicated roles. So you can actually define within Cloud Director specific roles which allow you to then specify whether which permissions the user has, which also gets expanded as you add plugins. They can add additional permissions as well, and then you need to assign them to roles as well. So you can either utilize the existing roles or you can have your own roles with specific permissions within Cloud Director. So that is more or less, let's say, the ground setting we have. And as I said, it's like you can actually have a service provider specific overarching user management. Many providers utilize that to link everything against their, let's say, customer user database, because many providers typically have one type of directory, whether it's Microsoft or Open LDAP, which they utilize, for example, not only for the Cloud Director, but also for ticket systems, for other systems like backup, recovery, DR, whatever they all have, and link that together. And then within Cloud Director, one of the good features is you can actually override this on a per tenant basis. so that an individual tenant could actually link this against their own either Active Directory or OpenLDAP. And what we always suggest is to put at least a service fee or something like that on top of that specific feature, because typically this requires maintenance. And as long as this hasn't changed in 10.5.1, this can still only be managed by the sysadmin. So it needs to be, it is provider managed how it's being called. Or has anyone in the round any other different information that this can now be really tenant based?
Nope.
Good. So that is the baseline. Before we dig into what we can do with SAML and SSO, so heading over to Toby. Anything you want to add to what I summed up already?
No, because you covered mainly all of the topics. The only thing I would like to add, especially for those who maybe start now with Cloud Director and say, okay, we will go first of all with LDAP. Please use LDAP S, no base LDAP anymore, because as we know, Microsoft is raising here the bar, and also VMware highly recommends to go with LDAP S, especially when it comes to stuff like password change and stuff like this. This is only supported via LDAP S and not via traditional LDAP. So that's the only thing from my side I would like to add, because you covered groups and stuff like this. So that's it from my side. Sasha?
Yeah, I would say a really important part, as most of the Cloud Director environments are public available. So please add two-factor authentication. That's a very important point. So we also talked about it in the Architecture Think Tank with all of the attendees. And yeah, it's a hard time for IT security, and we need to make sure that only persons who are really the persons are able to access the environments. That's a big part I want to add here. Yeah, and another part, it's not directly on the user management, but yeah, think about if it is really needed that your provider space, so the Cloud Director / provider, must be available over the public internet.
Which brings us to the point, use a proper load balancer solution, which has the capability of blocking the provider access. Yeah. Yeah, but especially, Sasha, you just mentioned something which is highly interesting, because since we started only talking about LDAP currently, so VCD does not have the ability to utilize LDAP with any kind of multi-factor authentication. So as long as you really stuck to LDAP, then you really need to think already about any kind of radio solution, whatever. But maybe is some additional stuff which needs to be done, because Cloud Director as from a starting perspective only supports, as Yves mentioned, LDAP out of the box. Matthias, something from your side you would like to add?
I start with SAML and then OIDC and that part.
Yeah, then I would say let's change, or let's go to the next topic, since Matthias just mentioned it. Let's talk about OpenID Connect, SAML, and stuff like this. So what's the idea behind, what's the reason behind, what's the advantage maybe also behind? So let's start with the stuff in that direction.
Just answer your own questions.
I raised them, you answer them.
No, I think it's important that that when we talk about SAML or all the identity systems we can attach to it, that we usually do this not only to attach them, but also to bring in multi-factor authentication. Cloud Director never had multi-factor authentication, and every discussion is always around the fact that it will not actually have that. And to be honest, I think that's a valid point, because most service providers have their own solutions anyway. And as we are going along, we need to make sure that we have a proper integration. And as VMware, especially now with, I mean, that's news, but since Omnissa is actually gone, the last part out of that equation is also more or less leaving the Broadcom house at least. And so there is basically no knowledge or no feature set internally. So it definitely makes sense to have that externally attached, whether you do that via SAML or OAuth or whatever else. I think doesn't make any huge difference. The important part is that you add something which is giving you multi-factor from that perspective and gives you the security. And how you do that within your individual network is completely up to you. Again, this differentiates Cloud Director from the from many other products because it's truly multi-tenant. So you can define for each one of your tenants these rules individually. So, and that is very important because when we speak about especially single sign-on, you do not necessarily want to have single sign-on from a third-party vendor. So only because the service provider provides a single sign-on solution, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to use the same in your company. If you have in your company something already established, like, for example, Workspace ONE or Microsoft Entra or something like that, then you easily can attach that to the Cloud Director interface. I'm not sure if even Cloud Director is already in the Microsoft App Marketplace, but for many applications by now you can actually within Microsoft more or less point and click and get all the configurations done. So that's really straightforward. And that allows customers really here to build their own solution and actually integrate whatever they have, or integrate things like Okta, for example.
Yeah, as you mentioned it already, because since we have two options inside Cloud Director, so we can go with SAML, we can go with OpenID Connect. I would say mostly all of the products are covered. So you can utilize Entra, you can utilize Okta, Workspace ONE, whatever you would like to have here. The only thing you need to have a look is what is maybe the better solution from an integration, if I go with SAML or if I go with OpenID Connect to get here fast forward. And also on the other hand, SAML maybe needs some additional steps that the user needs to be still created locally and then afterwards synced with the SAML provider. Or on the other hand, if I go with OpenID Connect, I have the possibility that automatically also the users and maybe groups, which is often highly interesting to also get groups into the Cloud Director environment, get synced between my OpenID Connect provider and my Cloud Director.
Yeah, let me add an important part so that we had in the discussions with the customers in the last months a lot of times, and it becomes more and more important that we add the customer SAML or OpenID to the Cloud Director, because what happens if we have onboarded a customer in a tenant environment and then one or two admins leave the company? So we need to make sure that we delete or disable the customers, and if we are connected directly with the customer environment or the customer AD with SAML or with Okta or whatever, then the customer or the tenant will disable their user in their environment, and they are automatically disabled in your Cloud Director environment. And I think that's an important part to cover here, to think about that different options that brings us more security.
What also should be kept in mind is, because bottom line, it doesn't matter if you use LDAP or SAML, OIDC, whatever, you still need to manage the user objects locally in Cloud Director, right? So you import it, and then you have the user or group object, and then you need to assign a role, either globally or for one or many organizations. What you could do with SAML or OIDC is you can flag the option defer roles or defer permissions to identity provider. So within connecting an external authentication source, it offers the possibility to create claim settings, which is more or less an attribute mapping. So you map cloud director attributes to authentication provider attributes to get like a username, first name, last name, email address, and so on and so forth. And within the claim settings, you can add an additional field which enables the authentication provider to hand over the role name which is used within Cloud Director. And if you create a new, or if you import an object, you can defer the role management to the identity provider. So that's a pretty cool feature, because in a real multi-tenant environment, and you split charges, so who's in charge of doing what, you can really hand over the complete roles management to the authentication administration team. That's what I call it. Whatever you name it, doesn't matter.
EIM.
What?
EIM, Identity and Access Management.
Yeah, whatever, right? So you just hand it over. So you're not in charge anymore of doing that. And it's also pretty cool for the tenants, because if the tenant is onboarded, he can hand over the whole identity management to the team who is in charge of doing it. Instead of messing around within Cloud Director, they can do it in their environment. And I think that's really sweet. Just keep in mind, you need to be very careful with the names. It's case sensitive, and if the handed over role name is not matching, it's not working, and stuff like this. So please do some proper testing before you rely on that solution. And as a provider, you still have the rights, so the rights bundles. So even though Eve is really proud of me now, because it took me 7 decades to figure out what the difference between the rights bundle and the roles bundle is. But no, just fun. So even though if a tenant fat fingers the role assignment using a proper rights bundle as a provider, I still have control kind of the permissions of the tenant environment, so they can't mess everything up just a little bit.
Just a little bit, yeah. One thing to add on that from my side, Matthias, what is always important, but especially when it comes to authentication, it is really important. Please verify or have the certificates in proper monitoring or calendar entry, whatever, because if the certificate is expiring, and there are 2 certificates always in place, there is one on the Cloud Director side, and the other one is on your identity source side. If one of them is expiring, yeah, then maybe your authentication is also not working anymore. So then maybe you are in the funny phase that you cannot log in, that you need to raise a ticket to the provider and say, hey, can you please create again a local account that I can fix it, or maybe we need to fix it with the provider together. So this is then something you as tenant also are in more or less a little bit in charge to have a look of the expiration date of the certificate.
But being honest, I like the phrase with the maybe you can't log in anymore. I like that. So the optional makes it really interesting, like a lottery game or something. But so nevertheless, the first org admin is always a local one. So just lock the password in a safe spot.
Good. One other topic which we haven't spoken so far about is the whole concept of that the API actually gets now slowly to the phase of being token-based and no longer username and password-based, because that also doesn't make any sense. Like any other vendor has figured out, username and password is not a good idea for service accounts. You should have API tokens and stuff like that. So Cloud Director finally made its slow steps to it, as Matthias is our API expert. So is it now finally available for all APIs, or is it still only for the new API? Now I caught him.
Surprise question.
Yes.
So the standard API still exists, even though it's deprecated sooner or later with any version. I don't know. I need to need to read the release notes. So it is for the Cloud API. It's working. So everything Cloud API stuff, it's still accepting username and password, but the token mechanism is also working. But since ever, I highly recommend switch over to the token mechanism. It's really smooth. You just go to the session API, authenticate yourself, username, password. You receive the token, go for it. Or you mean that the token you generate for you? You mean the other token? There are so many tokens now. I'm
because the one where you no longer use the username and password.
Yeah. That's the one. Yeah. It is working. I was chatting with a customer a few days ago about this topic, and he was complaining because there are parts of the API for which it's not working. Of course, not for the administrative parts, so the provider space. So for tenants, as far as I'm aware of, it's working across the all over the place. There are issues in the provider space, and for parts which it's definitely not working is the monitoring API. So for example, if you have a load balancer with a backend monitor for the cells, that access URL is not token-based accessible, so you need root access for this one still. It's not my fault. But for the tenant space, yes.
Did we get any information, or do we have something in mind when username password is going to be deprecated for tenants?
Who can pull up the release notes really fast?
Yeah. I more hope that it's going to be fast, because it's actually it would actually make the whole solution quite a bit more secure, because the username password for service accounts is really an outdated approach moving forward. But I mean, we have what we have. At least we have API tokens now, which is much better than many other VMware products at the moment. So,
but being honest, if we look at how VMware, no Broadcom by VMware, no VMware by Broadcom, implemented the whole API token management, it is really simple, because every single user just clicks on its own settings or preferences. It's either or. You just go in there and create the token. And the real cool thing about it is, if you are not sure if it might be exposed, you might lost it, whatever, you can revoke it yourself without creating a ticket, phone call, nothing needed. Just log in to Cloud Director and revoke it. That's huge. That's what I call self-service. Maybe we should instruct most of our CSPs to build a small instructions with some screenshots where to find it in the UI. But it's on the upper right corner. Just click on your name, the small arrow, click preferences, and if you can't see it, I have a
user preferences. It is user preferences, Matthias, not preferences. There is user preferences.
It's like preferences.
Like preferences.
I think we will simply add it to the topic list for our on-demand training, so then people can actually see how to use that from there, and make that one of the next topics for that one to add. Good. Do we have anything else? So we covered that. We covered the generics. Real quick on the 1 second.
Yeah, maybe one additional question for Matthias. Maybe you can quickly explain what the difference is between a system token and a user token.
It depends.
Okay.
Matthias, you actually answered that on that one question where it really actually I mean, the consultant answer is always good. Typically, it gets you out of every discussion, but in this case, it was like...
Good. I don't know.
It depends. I think, Toby, you need to answer it yourself.
I would say maybe we will cover this in one of the next sessions.
That was a classic.
Of course. It's always the right answer. It depends.
Yeah.
Okay, got him.
Yeah. No, I think the only other topic which we haven't covered is base passwords of your Cloud Director appliances, Postgres and stuff like that, because there are a few passwords and usernames down there as well. Password authentication for the database by now is mostly not token-based, but through some internal Postgres mechanism so that you don't need the username for it anymore, or it authenticates over the operating system. The VCD cell by itself, you have the root password, and you should better store that in a safe space, because whoever actually has root access to the VCD cell can make himself a sysadmin on the Cloud Director, and can also change the master admin passwords and stuff like that of the Cloud Director. And now you don't need to have studied rocket science to actually do that. You just actually Google for the necessary commands for that, and off you go, and you can make the changes. Yes, you need to restart the cell, but if you do that clever enough, no one will figure that one out, and all of a sudden admins wonder why they can't get into the system anymore. So better be very, very sure that you are protecting the base operating system of your VCD cells, including the consoles, so that you are not actually exposing yourself to any challenges over there, because that is the biggest security risk. But this is nothing really to blame VMware a lot for, because this is an impact for many other people, for many other tools as well. And I mean, it's always the discussion, should I have a password recovery mechanism or not? I had to use this too often with service providers where no one knew the admin password anymore. So it's good to have that.
So you know all the admin passwords.
No, I just changed them. And I have a Bitcoin wallet.
and you send a ton of emails each day.
No, but yeah, so there are ways to reset that. So this is absolutely no reason to actually, so if you ever get into that situation and you don't feel comfortable with it, we are more than happy to help you actually recover out of that situation. You can basically solve all of these, whether it's root password reset or change of the sysadmin password. Some of them require downtimes. Some of them can be done in a different way. But it should always be a last resort, because that at least partially resets also some tokens, and you might need to re-import certificates and a few other things. So it's really nothing we just do for fun. So better be sure that you save all the information. And ideally, as we always say, no one should actually log in as the master administrator anyway. You do that for the initial setup, and from there on, everybody should work with their own personalized username. It's the same what we always say when we work with service providers. We want to have normally accounts per user wherever possible, and not central like a ComDivision account or something like that, because it's always good to be clear on who is actually using which account. Not to blame anyone, but in case of a security incident or anything like that, it always is much better if you know what's happening and that you can actually lock down scenarios, because the last few security incidents, which at least I have been partially involved at customers, it could actually directly be brought back to specific users. That helps, because then you can lock out those users first and actually try to work on the other accounts and see if they are still secure or not. So that's more or less my final words on this one, I would say, because I think we covered most of the topics, and we've already covered half an hour most, and I think that's extensive on this. I haven't seen any questions bubble up. So again, as always, if you have any questions on any of the topics, if you have any topic suggestions, Or if you actually want to be part of a live show, we are always welcoming guests. So if you ever want to if you have an interesting story around VMware Cloud Director or a use case of Cloud Director or something like that, feel free to ping any one of us. And then we are actually going to work through the schedule and figure out when we can put you on one of the next shows. The next episode is going to be episode 31. Maybe then we have a version update, which we originally planned for this one, but hey, you never know. Surprises are everywhere. We will also, ideally at episode 31, latest 32, we will give you the timeline when the EMEA Architecture Think Tank is going to happen, which is going to be somewhere this year. So we hope to see some of our listeners or watchers at the Architecture Think Tank later on this year in EMEA. And with that being said, I'm saying goodbye. Follow us on social media and see you all on the next episode. Toby.
Thanks for joining. See you in the next episode. Bye. Matthias.
Yeah, think about deferring the whole role management to that entity provider, because you as a VCD admin have less work and you can blame someone else. Have fun. Bye.
Yeah, thank you for joining, and make sure your environment is safety and you have multi-factor authentication in place. That's important. Bye.
See you all. Bye.